Mr. President, I appreciate the passion that my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from the state of Nevada, puts into her job and into scrutinizing and debating legislation. I appreciate the concerns that she's expressed. Now, if I believed all the things that she said, or just about any of the things that she said, I'd be concerned too. Fortunately for all of us, the things that she's saying about this bill are either in some instances incomplete, leaving out material information to complete the picture, resulting in a much different impact than has been suggested, or in other cases, they're completely wrong. Let's go back to a few first principles about what the bill actually does. There are two basic precepts of the bill. The fundamental purpose of it is to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We do that through two principal mechanisms in the bill. One requires proof of citizenship upon voter registration, and the other requires voter ID at the time and place of voting. Now, as to the citizenship component, contrary to what was being suggested briefly for a moment, I was almost led to believe in some of her remarks that this would require Americans en masse to go and immediately re-register. Perhaps I misunderstood her on that part. If I did, my apologies, but just so that there is no ambiguity at all, so that we're very clear on what it is that it does and what it is that it does not do. It doesn't require mass re-registration. If you've already registered to vote, there's nothing about that that's going to invalidate your voter registration. If you move to another state, or you otherwise have to register to vote as you would if you have to move, for example, from one state to another, then you will have to register at that point. But there's nothing about your existing registration that's going to be nullified just because this bill becomes law. And on the point of the proof of citizenship, there's been a lot of misunderstanding, some of it in good faith, although the bill itself has just been characterized by my friend and colleague from Nevada as, quote, beyond bad faith and, quote, vile. Those are pretty sweeping accusations, and I don't ever make those lightly on any piece of legislation. If I do, I'm prepared to back them up. Those can't be backed up here. There's nothing about this that is in bad faith. There's nothing about this that is vile. This is dealing with a very common sense problem, a problem that has been many decades in the making. Decades in the making ever since, in some ways, Congress passed the National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA, in 1993, the Motor Voter Law. At the time, it was understood that we could allow participating states, of which nearly all states participate, to set up a process whereby voters could, while applying for a driver's license at their local DMV, also register to vote. After all, it involves some of the same information. You've got to establish who you are when you apply for a driver's license, and also when you register to vote. There are some things that have happened since then that have changed the landscape. One of them has been that 20 years after the enactment of the NVRA, the Supreme Court, in a case called Arizona versus Intertribal Council of Arizona, concluded that the NVRA preempts out the state's ability to even request any type of documentation or other proof of citizenship. Even if they're aware of circumstances suggesting that some would-be voters are in fact not citizens, they're prohibited from doing so. And remember, all you have to do under the NVRA form is sign your name after checking a box saying, yes, I would like simultaneously to register to vote. So if the states are then prohibited from even inquiring into citizenship, attempting to document it, to prove it or otherwise, then there is no way to make this happen. And as a result of that, it leaves open this open gaping wound. We now have an estimated 30 million plus non-citizens residing in this country. And that leads to another development that's relevant to this. Over the years, there were differences of opinion between the states as to whether, to what extent, in what circumstances to offer driver's licenses to non-citizens. In some cases, they would issue them to non-citizens as long as they were lawfully here. In other cases, they wouldn't issue them to any. Over the years, it's evolved to the point where in nearly every state, you can get a driver's license as a non-citizen. And in 19 states, plus the District of Columbia, you can get a driver's license even if you are in the United States unlawfully. So in light of that fact, and in light of the Supreme Court ruling in 2013 saying that the states, even if they have reason to believe some voters are not eligible because they're not citizens, they can't look into it further because the NVRA supposedly preempted them out. As wrong as I think that ruling was as a matter of statutory interpretation, it is conclusive and it stands to this day. And you add to that the fact that we had an estimated 10 or 15 million people enter this country unlawfully between 2021 and 2025. You add all that up together, and it becomes even a little more startling. You realize that in several states, they've made a decision to allow non-citizens to vote in some local elections. In those cases, there's still voter registration that goes into that, and those states, along with the most blue states in America, have refused to enter into any kind of memorandum of understanding or otherwise cooperate or enter into a cooperative agreement with federal agencies to ascertain whether, to what extent, and what circumstances there might be non-citizens registered to vote in their state. Nor have they been willing to cooperate with the federal authorities who manage the so-called SAVE database within the Department of Homeland Security. They haven't been willing to show them any methodology or any techniques that they use in those particular states that allow some non-citizen voting to occur in local elections. They've done nothing to show how it is that they separate out those voter registration files from the voter registration files of those who are eligible to vote in federal elections. This creates a genuine vulnerability, the one that we couldn't, in good faith, just overlook and pretend doesn't exist. So let me just say that insofar as people find concerns with the methods that we have allowed you to use when establishing your citizenship at the time of voter registration, if we've left out some form of documentation that should have been included to make this easier, let us know. I'd love to consider that. But the truth is, we were very inclusive with it. One important thing to keep in mind is that this is not the only circumstance in which Americans are routinely required to establish their citizenship. Perhaps the most familiar one on the books currently exists in the context of labor and employment. Every time any American starts a new job with a new employer inside the United States, he or she is required to fill out a form called the I-9. When you fill out the I-9, if you're an American, then you have to prove that you are a citizen. It's a pretty rigid, fairly inflexible standard. One technique involves showing a U.S. passport establishing citizenship. Another involves a combination of a birth certificate, photo ID, social security card, etc. But that's about it. That's about as far as the options go. There are additional options that we worked into the Save America Act, including, for example, that subset of real ID driver's licenses. Not all real ID driver's licenses establish citizenship. Some of them do, some of them don't. If you happen to have one of those that establishes that, you can accept that. Certain tribal membership cards are also eligible because they establish citizenship. Not all of them do. We try to identify those that do. But most importantly, and this is the part that often goes overlooked when we hear comments from the other side of the aisle in this chamber, is that there is a catch-all provision dealing with all these circumstances, any deficits that we may have left out, and it also deals with the problem of those who maybe can't find some of their documentation. Let's say if you're someone who's gotten married and you have changed your name after getting married, and you got the rest of your documents, but you can't find your marriage certificate, we've got you taken care of. But the same provision in the same part of the bill also deals with individuals who may have lost all their documentation, either because it was eaten by their dog, or maybe their house burned down yesterday and all their documents are missing, or because they never had them to begin with, or their crazy Aunt Madge, for no reason at all, scooped up all the documents, took them to the landfill, disposed of them, and nobody can find them. Or maybe you just never had them to begin with for whatever reason. These things happen. This bill doesn't cast any judgment about those people. This bill doesn't desire in any way, shape, or form to disenfranchise those people or make them ineligible to register to vote. In fact, it makes it incredibly easy. The provision to which I'm referring, that too often goes overlooked, more or less universally goes overlooked from across the aisle, starts on page 12 of the House-passed Save America Act, which we're debating right now. The bill on the table at page 12, line 22, and following through the text going on to the next page, makes clear that even if you're missing some of your documentation or even all of it, regardless of the reason, and you want to register to vote, you can still do so by writing out an affidavit. It establishes a process whereby a stock affidavit structure could be recommended by a committee that's long existed to help facilitate some of these election issues. And each state would then fine-tune the process that they would utilize in their state, whereby the would-be voter who writes out a sworn statement under penalty of perjury outlining the circumstances that give them citizenship. Meaning, if they were born in the United States or otherwise natural-born citizens of the United States, perhaps if they're born outside but to U.S. citizen parents residing abroad at the moment, and were at the moment of their birth, by virtue of the circumstances of their birth, entitled to birthright citizenship as of the moment of their birth, then they are natural-born citizens. They can establish those basic facts, and then the burden falls upon the state to confirm or refute the truthfulness of those things. States have access to databases by which they can compare and contrast what the voter says in the affidavit, saying, yeah, I don't have my documents, but I am a citizen, and here's why, and here are the relevant dates or date ranges to consider. It becomes the state's burden. No American citizen need shell out a single dollar. This is one of the other arguments that I frequently hear raised, is that not every American has a passport. Well, yeah, that's true. And then they'll also go on and say, well, a passport costs money, about 200 bucks. That's also true. Nobody should have to go out and get a passport just to vote. If they've got one, great. It makes it easy to establish citizenship, but you don't need to have one. You don't have to shell out a single dime to register to vote under this bill. Nor do you have to go out and get duplicate documents or be left out in the cold because you can't find your documents, or they never existed, or you never had them, or your house burned down. Whatever the case, this is taken care of. But this, too, was ignored by my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Nevada. This question is startling because we hear over and over again how people are going to be left out in the cold, and yet every American who has ever had a job as an employee with an American company in the United States of America has had to establish their citizenship under standards using documents that are far less forgiving, far more rigid, far less flexible than what we allow here. Now look, it is theoretically possible, not likely, but theoretically possible that there are other ways of establishing citizenship not yet contemplated in this bill that would still do the job. If so, bring those ideas forward. Help us improve the bill. We'd be happy to do it. I think we've made it as easy as we possibly could. But I'd love to hear those ideas, but that's not what we're hearing. They're instead wanting to engage in scaremongering tactics in order to make people fear that they're suddenly going to be disenfranchised, that they're suddenly going to face what some are really disingenuously calling a poll tax, dishonestly suggesting that this will cost anyone money. There's not a reason for anyone to shell out a single dime, a single nickel, a single penny, or fraction thereof in order to register to vote. So when we look at the proof of citizenship, it's simply not fair to point to any one of these documents in isolation and explain the reasons why some people might not have them, might never have had them, might have lost them, and why it's such a travesty that people will be disenfranchised without them unless they either spend money or spend days or weeks hunting down all the relevant documentation, because there are other easier ways to establish that. And if you've got ways of making it even easier while satisfying this demand, that we make sure that only those who are citizens are voting, let's bring them forward. It is curious, moreover, getting back to the states, not just the states in which they currently allow lawful votes to be cast in some local elections by known admitted non-citizens, But beyond that, there's a wide range of states, mostly with Democratic governors and or Democrat legislatures, that are refusing to cooperate at all with federal authorities to share anything about their voter registration files, to share the information to make sure that those voting in federal elections are in fact U.S. citizens. Now look, this is part of the cooperative federalism model that's built into the Constitution itself. There are certain responsibilities that belong to the United States government. And it's as equally important to respect those powers that are distinctively, unavoidably, necessarily, and by the text and structure of the Constitution, federal. It's important to keep those in federal hands, just as it's important to reserve to the states the powers that are reserved to the states, not rendered federal, and not prohibited to the states by the Constitution. Both are equally important to federalism. Bad things happen when we disrespect either. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, we have the power, it is our authority, and I believe it is our duty to set basic terms and conditions relevant specifically to these federal elections, elections for the U.S. House of Representatives, elections to the United States Senate. Those are, after all, federal races. And which government is it, the state or local level, that ascertains and has records sufficient to establish, confirm, or refute citizenship? Well, it's this government. In fact, one of the very first provisions of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, outlining federal power by outlining the powers granted to Congress. It involves laws dealing with immigration, naturalization, and citizenship. It is this government, it is the only government in the United States, and no one state has the capacity to do that, to establish or refute the existence of citizenship. So why would so many states that happen to be run by the Democratic Party refusing entirely to cooperate, to enter into memoranda of understanding, or otherwise cooperate with federal agencies whose job it is to go through and figure out who is and who is not a citizen for purposes of voting in federal elections? That, too, is another reason why we need the Save America Act, because this is chaos if we don't do that. If we don't do that, then our laws are dead letter. Our laws saying that only U.S. citizens may vote. And if a non-U.S. citizen votes in a federal election, he or she has committed a serious felony offense. Then people often will point to the dearth, the paucity, the rarity of instances in which voter fraud, particularly voter fraud based on non-citizen voting, has been detected, charged, fully prosecuted, and resulted in a conviction. Yes, these are few. These are very, very few overall that have happened, and there are reasons why it is very few. When you have a system of laws in place, it makes it very easy to register to vote, even for those who might not be citizens. And it makes it impossible for a state to even inquire, even where actual doubts exist as to someone's citizenship. You make it almost impossible to detect and very, very difficult to prosecute. Voting is, moreover, something that happens in a finite time and place, and most of the time, by the time it all happens, the matter is moot, and so it can be difficult to move on. And this is why I sometimes will compare this to when people say we don't need to put these procedures in place because it's already against the law for non-citizens to vote, therefore they don't vote, and that's why it's so rare. That's a little bit like saying we don't need laws that require liquor stores to make people show ID before they buy alcohol, because we already have laws prohibiting the sale of alcoholic beverages to children. If we didn't have ID laws or record-keeping requirements in place for such things, that too would be very, very difficult, close to impossible to detect and enforce and prosecute and result in convictions. So, look, this debate will continue. I look forward to hearing any contributions, any suggestions as to how we could make it better and more inclusive. But the status quo in which we simply pretend that this does not happen isn't tenable. We already know, based on the handful of states that have started their own investigations, that there are thousands, just in the last year or two alone, we've learned of thousands of voter registration files that have existed that have involved non-citizens. And with as many non-citizens as have entered this country recently in the development of our laws, it would be folly, it would be morally irresponsible for us to assume that this does not happen. But let's keep our debate focused on truth, on facts, on what the bill actually says and not what it doesn't say. Thank you, Mr. President.